Hello, my name is Larry Rizzolo, and welcome back to Session 3. In Session 1, we reviewed some of the history of Black Americans that underlie the issues of zoning, housing, and access to the beaches that trouble us today. Those issues were discussed in Session 2, Parts A and B. In Session 3, we will consider a small handful of Black leaders and activists and how they thought about social justice. A more comprehensive discussion would take an entire semester. Session 3 will lead us to Session 4's discussion of how these ideas in history are considered in our public schools. The following quotes amplify William Faulkner's admonition that the past is not dead, it is not even past, and help us recall the underlying theme of our course. Dr. Luther King Jr. needs no introduction. No society can fully repress an ugly past when the ravages persist into the present. Earl B. Davis is the founder of the African American Heritage House at the Chautauqua Institute in New York. The Institute's lecture series, arts programs, and courses address many contemporary issues. Earl says to get the present right, you have to get the history right. Edwin Williams informed our discussion of New Haven's Newhallville neighborhood that we discussed in Session 2A. Truth be told, history isn't so much about the past as it is concerning the present we don't see. By the end of this session, you should be able to discuss the following debates. Should the newly freed Black Americans first work for economic development or political rights? Should Black people return to Africa? How did different women reframe these questions to address more universal concerns, and what role was played by intersectionality? Second, we should be able to describe how agency factors into these debates. Here's the lecture plan. We'll compare and contrast Booker T. Washington versus W.B. Du Bois versus Marcus Garvey. Then we'll consider the struggles of Black women to develop their voices in the face of racism and sexism. And finally, we'll examine solutions that assume that the attitudes of many white Americans won't change in the short term, but that American ideals can eventually be realized. Let's begin with W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington and their differing views about the best steps forward for the enslaved people who were freed by the Civil War. Former slaves couldn't read or write, lacked an understanding of business practices or government, were naive about the world they were going to enter. W.E.B. Du Bois was born a free man in Massachusetts and graduated from Fisk and Harvard universities. These institutions focused on academic achievement. Du Bois co-founded the NAACP and became the editor of its newspaper, The Crisis. Booker T. Washington was born a slave and raised in West Virginia, although slavery ended when he was 5. He avoided the fate of working in the mines by going to school and working for an elderly white woman. He would clean house for her, and she demanded excellence. She would use the white glove treatment to assess the quality of his work. To further his education, he used virtually all his money to get to Richmond and ended up living on the street. He begged for money and made his way to Hampton College, but the session had already started. He begged, "Could you please let me in?" The women at the reception desk said, "Wait in this room while we discuss your case, and while you're there, clean up the place." They were so impressed by how well he cleaned up the place, they let him in. Washington prospered at Hampton with its focus on learning a trade in the morning and basic academic skills in the afternoon. Washington founded Tuskegee University based on the Hampton model. Tuskegee developed into a fine institution because his superior, non-threatening oratory attracted the financial support of Southern and Northern white Americans of means. The educational philosophy of these two men reflected the colleges, now universities, that they attended. Their philosophies were not mutually exclusive. The debates centered around where the new institutions should focus their programs during Reconstruction in the early years afterwards. Du Bois advocated encouraging bright students to go to the best colleges, engage the entire spectrum of liberal arts. Educated leaders were needed to press for the vote and advance the cause of Black Americans through law and government. Besides, who else would teach in Washington's schools? Washington would argue back, what good is Shakespeare to those who cannot put food on the table? Suffrage is not our main problem. We should put off fighting for the vote until a solid Black working class can be established. Washington reminded Du Bois that he was born a free man, but Washington lived among Southern racists who would just as soon lynch him without a second thought. Instead, Washington's approach was to convince white allies he didn't want power over them. He wants to work within the white community. If only they would fund him, he would demonstrate how their investment would lead to productive Black Americans who would be a credit to them. In other words, learn to get along with your former oppressors and learn skills that white Americans would want to hire and produce products they would want to buy. Accordingly, mornings were devoted to learning the trades and afternoons devoted to reading, writing, and arithmetic. Du Bois in Washington had a profound effect on the development of historically Black colleges and universities. The HBCUs were created by missionaries for Black freemen before and after the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureau during Reconstruction, and private philanthropy that continued after Reconstruction ended. Roughly half the new schools followed the philosophy of Du Bois or Washington, who in turn were influenced by the schools they attended. Both Du Bois and Washington planted their flags, so to speak, in the United States, but their contemporary, Marcus Garvey, advocated a return to Africa. He founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Garvey believed seeking political power was a fool's errand because white allies were too few. To maintain their primacy, white Americans would always try to isolate Black Americans through segregation. Raised in Jamaica, Garvey concluded that colonialism created and spread racism worldwide. The solution was an international movement that would return the Black diaspora to Africa and kick the colonists out. He was quite the character and declared himself the provisional president of Africa. Intersectionality was coined to describe the interaction of two or more types of discrimination. In this case, Black women had to simultaneously fight sexism and racism. In the 19th century, Black men argued that women should support men and educate children. Beginning in the 1820s, women in the North overcame men's resistance to become a regular presence on the pulpit, community organizers, publishers of newspapers and newsletters, and sought-after speakers on the lecture circuit. This training prepared them for action on the national stage. There are too many to discuss here. I recommend Vanguard by Martha S. Jones. Pictured here are a handful of the leading figures. I will highlight the work of Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells Barnett, and Fannie Lou Hamer. Historically, the women's agenda was more universal than that of Black men and white suffragists. The women wanted to improve the lot of all Americans, regardless of color, especially the lower classes. Of course, they also fought slavery and racism. But more than that, they fought sexism and poverty. They fought to promote the general welfare and education of all. They wanted suffrage for all Americans, Black and white, men and women. This tradition is carried forward by women through the 21st century. I chose Maxine Waters as an example of women in Congress and state legislatures, Stacey Abrams as an example of activists, and Kamala Harris as the first vice president. Ida B. Wells Barnett was a contemporary of Washington and Du Bois. She was a suffragist, and when she married, she was apparently the first woman to hyphenate her last name. but her enduring work was as a journalist who advocated for migrants who came north in the face of opposition from both Northern white and Northern Black Americans. Her seminal work was her investigation of lynching, which was an effective way of controlling a Black population. I was taught that lynching was done by vigilantes who took their victims out of town, out of public view. Actually, many lynchings were public spectacles held in front of the courthouse with police looking the other way. A big part of this was to teach children that lynching was a normal part of life. This is how you treat Black people who get out of line. They saw the enthusiasm of all the authority figures in their life, their fathers and uncles, their teachers, the preacher, and so on. The next picture may be disturbing, so I'll give you a moment, if you wish, to close your eyes. I show this photo to illustrate the point. It's a group portrait. Note that everyone is facing the camera. The background of the photo is washed out, but I think you can make out that this is a town square. This building might be a church or a municipal building. You can see houses along this side. The crowd is dressed in their Sunday best. Note the children lined up in front. Many attempts to pass an anti-lynching bill failed due to Southern filibusters. These included the Dreyer Anti-Lynching Bill of 1922, the Costigan-Wagner Anti-Lynching Bill of 1934, the Fair Employment Practices Bill of 1946. An anti-lynching bill was passed only last year. There is a memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, to all the people who were lynched, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. This photo from the New York Times announces the memorial's opening in 2018. 800 pillars are suspended from the ceiling, one for each county where a lynching took place. Every state in the nation is represented here. If you look at this one, at the bottom, you can see the name of the county that the pillar represents. If you look along the face of the slab, you could see one or more names. Those are the individuals that were lynched in that county. The number of documented victims totals 3,000. Let's go back a few years and turn to women's suffrage. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 is considered the start of the suffrage movement. No Black women were on the program, but Black women insinuated themselves into the movement. Here we see a formerly enslaved woman, Sojourner Truth. She took her name because she was inspired by God to journey to the truth. Her extemporaneous speech at the 1951 Ohio Women's Convention attracted nationwide attention. Although she was born in New York and Dutch was her first language, her speech was translated into a stereotypical Black Southern dialect. The speech came to be known as the Ain't I a Woman speech. The relationship between Black and white suffragists was tepid, and Black women were excluded from conventions that included Southern white women. One concern was that a woman's former slave might have a higher position in the movement. In the end, to pass the 19th Amendment, the suffragists had to appease the Southerners, and President Woodrow Wilson, who you may recall from Session 1, was a racist. Essentially, Black women were thrown under the bus. Let's fast forward to the 1960s and someone you might recall. Fannie Lou Hamer was born into a sharecropper family in Mississippi and lived there all her life. Her body showed the effects of bending over to pick cotton, and her arms were scarred from the thorny cotton seeds. After raising her family, she became an activist when she was denied the right to vote. Since the 19th Amendment did nothing for her, she centered her advocacy on the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. White outrage over her attempt to register to vote led to police brutality. At their hands, she lost sight of one eye and suffered kidney damage. Nonetheless, Hamer persisted and received national attention from her address to the Credentials Committee at the 1964 Democratic Convention. Because Black Americans could not vote for members of the Mississippi delegation, the delegation was all white. The party Hamer founded, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, formed their own slate and asked the committee to credential her delegation and seat them in the convention. Lyndon Johnson tried to minimize the impact of her testimony by scheduling a major speech at the same time. Nonetheless, the committee listened in rapt attention. Even though the networks cut to his speech, Johnson's ploy failed, as Hamer's testimony was repeated in its entirety in that evening's news shows. Hamer received token support and a symbolic victory. Her delegation was seated, but were allowed little influence. Let's switch gears and ask, can white Americans change their attitudes towards Black Americans? Certainly, there's been substantial progress, but we have not achieved Martin Luther King's dream of a colorblind society. And today, there appears to be backsliding that has many complex causes. That has always been the way of American history. Since the Civil War, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Let's look at 4 authors, certainly not a comprehensive expression of Black thinking, but a place to start. We have already met Marcus Garvey. Recall that Garvey believed white America could not change substantially in his lifetime. Others shared this notion at the time, notably Martin Delany. Although Delany and Frederick Douglass collaborated on a publication, The North Star, Douglass advocated staying in America. James Baldwin was an acclaimed author, essayist, playwright, and poet. A wonderful biography and critique of his work, Begin Again, was written by Eddie Glaude. He carried forward the ideas of Du Bois and Frederick Douglass that full citizenship required the vote. Shelby Steele is an author, columnist, and documentary filmmaker who served for 20 years as an English professor at the San Jose State University. His book, The Content of Our Character, expressed his conservative views on race and social progress. He is the philosophical father of John McWhorter. John McWhorter teaches linguistics and African American studies at the Columbia University. His essays on race relations and linguistics appear regularly in the New York Times. He has picked up the torch from Shelby Steele to express conservative views in this generation. Let's consider James Baldwin. Baldwin was more comfortable living in France, where racism didn't exist, but he felt an obligation to return to the U.S. and fight to end racism. He thought, we can make America a better place. When asked his views on the Black problem, Baldwin would say, there is no Black problem, it's a white problem. His belief in the inherent goodness of all people led him to conclude that white Americans simply don't understand Black history and the struggles of Black Americans, because that history has been erased. Accordingly, through education, racist views would disappear of their own accord. Of course, this didn't happen. Baldwin was frustrated by the backlash to the advances in the civil rights movements of the 60s and the murders of Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr. But he remained hopeful, as expressed in his quote that began this course. Not everything is lost. Responsibility cannot be lost. It can only be abdicated. If one refuses abdication, one begins again. Steele and McWhorter hold a conservative view that is often misconstrued by right-wing activists. They believe that racism exists and ask how to move forward despite the slow evolution of white attitudes. They argue that despite racial hatred, Black Americans have agency. Success is achievable despite white fragility and police misbehavior. Advocacy and social protest are valuable tools to promote systemic change, but white attitudes won't change anytime soon. Individuals must learn to advance themselves within today's racist environment. For example, McWhorter points out that in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, racial hatred was much worse than today, yet ordinary people built wealthy neighborhoods in many cities. There were many Black Wall Streets besides the famous one in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But unlike Tulsa, they were not burned to the ground by white supremacists. There was Bronzeville in Chicago, pictured here at the right, Harlem in New York City, and Seneca Village in New York City. Seneca Village was appropriated by the city to make way for Central Park. The Metropolitan Art Museum sits on the edge of the former village and has a standing art exhibit in its honor. Let's not forget the Newhallville neighborhood in New Haven, which was discussed in session 2A. These neighborhoods were complete enclaves within the larger city, with Black-owned banks, groceries, department stores, theaters, and so on. In his 2022 book, The Other Side of Prospect, Nicholas DeWitthoff uses Newhallville as one example of how these neighborhoods rose and fell into decline. Prospect Street demarcates the boundary between wealthy Yale University and depressed Newhallville. Steele and McWhorter argue that well-meaning programs such as affirmative action are counterproductive because they undermine the agency of the Black individual and make him or her question their ability to succeed without special assistance. Instead of race, affirmative action might be used for anyone in the lower classes who were denied educational opportunities when they were growing up. To explore the idea of agency, let's summarize the ideas of Steele and McWhorter and revisit the revitalization of neighborhoods in Chicago, Buffalo, and New York City that we discussed in session 2B. In Chicago, Naomi Davis leads Blacks in Green. In Buffalo, Rawa Gurmishan leads Push. And in New York City, Majora Carter leads the revitalization of Hunts Point. Her book, Reclaiming Your Community, You Don't Have to Move Out of Your Community to Live in a Better One, is listed in the biography. Steele and McWhorter believe that for systemic change, it is appropriate to play the victim of an oppressive society. But the best strategy for individuals to succeed against stiff odds is self-motivation and a bit of luck, grabbing opportunities as they present themselves. This notion should not be confused with laziness or lack of initiative, a prejudice that was carried forward from slavery. After all, why should the odds be stiff? To fight that, mass action and playing the victim card is a way to go. But hundreds of years of telling that narrative can make a people believe that of themselves. There has to be a counter-narrative to persuade Black Americans that they do have agency, and white Americans need to dispel a deeply ingrained subconscious narrative of white supremacy that has been cultivated over hundreds of years. The Steele and McWhorter premise is that the latter will not occur fast enough in our lifetimes. Developing agency is at the heart of community organizing that we discussed last time. The downtrodden don't realize their power or the value of their home. So when developers come and say, you know, your house wasn't worth all that much, and here's what I'm willing to give you. The developers know the true value because they'll flip the house to gentrify the neighborhood. So needing money, folks jump at the chance, not realizing they undersold their property. Through community organizing, residents learn about what they have and what they can do, and the organizers learn what residents need. Organizers ask, what are the pain points? Fix potholes, better street lighting, broadband? Then they use their contacts to solve the problem, and the community learns that their voices matter. Gradually, this leads to an action plan developed by the community. Plans in hand, the community can apply for grants that they administer. This in turn leverages philanthropy. Rather than paternalism, funding agencies should be in partnership with communities. I discussed an affordable housing project in New Haven with Majora Carter, and she was skeptical. She regarded programs like that as keeping people down, making them believe outsiders need to come in and help them. Recall the upset of the Newhallville residents when outsiders came in to rebuild their community center, and how the city learned from those protests that they need to involve residents next time when they propose affordable housing. You might consider whether your favorite philanthropy works in partnership with communities or whether they support more of a top-down approach. In summary, Du Bois advocated a liberal arts education to develop Black professionals. Washington advocated a pragmatic education to develop a solid working class. Garvey advocated a return to Africa. Black women had to fight sexism and racism to advocate for a broader program of social justice. While individuals can exert their agency to achieve some success, systemic change is needed for America to live up to its ideals. And financial support and volunteerism should be directed towards community-led development and social justice organizations that are informed by the Black community. Thank you for your attention thus far. I end with how we started this session. I like the way my friend Earl Davis framed it. To get the present right, you have to get the history right. How well did schools do that? Please join me next time when we examine how Black American history was erased, the efforts to restore it, and current efforts to suppress it once again. See you next time. I would like to thank Dennis Culleton from the Witness Stone Project, Joel Halander, Guilford Town historian, Earl Davis of the African American Heritage House in Chautauqua, New York, and Camille Borders, Princeton University and the African American Heritage House, for their helpful discussions. Carol Rizzolo provided help and encouragement. Edwin Williams and Charla Nietzsche provided stories about New Haven's Dixwell and Newhallville neighborhoods. Special thanks to Tracy Tomaselli, the Historical Room, the Guilford Free Library, who provided research materials and helpful suggestions. Please feel free to contact me at larry.rizzolo@gmail.com.